When I first moved into the neighborhood, I thought I had found the perfect place to settle in. The homes were neatly lined, the lawns manicured, and the streets quiet except for the occasional sound of children playing or someone mowing their grass. It was the kind of suburban development that promised peace of mind and a sense of community. At least that was what the real estate agent had sold me on. What I didn't know was that beneath the freshly painted fences and the polite waves of passing neighbors, there lurked a storm just waiting for the right spark to set it off. For me, that spark came in the shape of a vehicle, my Jeep. The Jeep wasn't just any car. It was something I had worked years to buy, something I had modified, customized, and treated with almost obsessive care. It had off-road tires, a powerful suspension, and a few personal touches that made it unique. It was not just transportation. It was a statement of hard work, independence, and freedom. When I parked it in my driveway, I felt a little swell of pride each time I walked by. Apparently, I wasn't the only one who noticed it. About a month into living there, I began to catch strange glances from one of my neighbors. She lived 3 houses down, in a pastel blue 2-story with matching shutters and a lawn that looked almost too perfect. Her name, as I would later find out, was Karen. She had the kind of personality that made her stand out immediately. Her voice carried across the street even when she wasn't shouting, and she had that way of moving as though every corner of the neighborhood was her territory. The first time she introduced herself, it wasn't so much a friendly greeting as it was an inspection, her eyes darting past me to scan my home, my yard, and most importantly, my Jeep. She mentioned it right away. "Nice car," she said, though her tone was more calculating than complimentary. It was the kind of comment that left me unsure whether I should thank her or lock my doors. From then on, I noticed she always lingered a second too long whenever she walked past my driveway. Sometimes she would slow her pace, her eyes running along the Jeep as though mentally checking its features. Once I even caught her circling it when she thought I wasn't home. At the time, I brushed it off as harmless curiosity, but looking back, I should have recognized it as the first warning sign. It all escalated one Saturday morning. I had just returned from an early errand, parked my Jeep in the driveway, and gone inside to make breakfast. Barely 20 minutes later, I heard voices outside. Curious, I peeked through the blinds and froze. There was Karen standing in front of my Jeep with her teenage daughter beside her. They were examining the car like it was sitting in a dealership lot. The daughter looked excited, pointing at the tires, the paint, the interior through the windows. Karen had her arms crossed, nodding along as if she were confirming some kind of decision. I remember my heart tightening, not out of fear, but out of that strange sense of dread when you realize someone is about to cross a line. Later, I would learn the daughter had just gotten her license and Karen had been promising her a car. Apparently, in Karen's mind, my Jeep wasn't mine. It was the perfect gift waiting for her daughter to claim. I didn't confront them that morning. Instead, I stayed behind the blinds watching, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Eventually, they walked away, but not before Karen took out her phone and snapped a few pictures of the Jeep. That image is burned into my mind. Karen, with her smug smile, capturing photos of my property like she already owned it. The real trouble began a week later. It was early evening, and I had just gotten home from work. As I pulled into the driveway, I noticed Karen standing near the edge of my lawn. She didn't move when I parked. Instead, she marched straight toward me the moment I got out. She didn't bother with pleasantries. Her words, though I won't repeat them exactly, boiled down to this. She wanted my Jeep for her daughter. Not to borrow, not to rent, she wanted me to give it to her. She said her daughter deserved it, that it was a waste for me to hog such a vehicle, and that neighbors should look out for each other. Her tone made it sound less like a request and more like a demand, as though she had already decided this was going to happen and I was just an obstacle in her way. I remember standing there, stunned, wondering if she was joking. But the seriousness in her eyes told me otherwise. When I refused, her face hardened. She muttered something about people in the neighborhood needing to share resources and stormed off. I thought that was the end of it, a bizarre encounter I could laugh about later. I was wrong. The next morning, I walked outside to find a note tucked under my Jeep's windshield wiper. In neat but firm handwriting, it said something along the lines of, "This car will be better used by someone who actually needs it. Be reasonable." No name, no signature, but I knew exactly who it was from. I tried to shrug it off, but over the next few days, the tension grew thicker. Karen and her daughter began parking their car closer and closer to my driveway, almost as if to mark territory. They would stand on their porch and watch me when I washed my Jeep. And every so often, I would catch Karen muttering to another neighbor while pointing in my direction. The situation hit a breaking point on a Tuesday evening. I had just finished dinner when there was a loud knock at the door. When I opened it, 2 police officers were standing on my porch. Their expressions were professional, but firm. They informed me that someone had reported a stolen vehicle, my Jeep. In that moment, I felt a mix of anger and disbelief crash over me. Karen had actually called the police and reported my own car as stolen, claiming it belonged to her daughter. She had given them descriptions, even photographs, the same ones I had seen her take weeks earlier. I knew I had the paperwork, the title, the registration, everything in order. But that didn't erase the humiliation of standing there while officers inspected the Jeep in my own driveway, neighbors peeking through their blinds to see what drama was unfolding. It could have been much worse, though, because what Karen didn't know was that I had someone on my side she never expected, a close family friend who happened to be a state attorney. At the time, I didn't reveal that connection. I simply provided the officers with the paperwork, proved ownership, and watched as their demeanor shifted. They apologized, explained they had to follow up on the report, and left. Karen, meanwhile, was standing a few feet away, her arms crossed, and that same smug expression on her face. She was convinced she had the upper hand, but she had no idea what storm she had just unleashed, because that was the night I decided enough was enough. If she wanted to escalate this into a battle, I was ready, and I had far more firepower than she could ever imagine. The stage was set. What began as curiosity over a Jeep was about to spiral into a neighborhood showdown that would expose Karen for who she really was, and it would all be thanks to the connection she never knew I had. After that humiliating evening with the police at my door, I thought maybe, just maybe, Karen would back off. Surely, after her false report had been exposed within minutes, she would retreat, lick her wounds, and find some other unfortunate neighbor to pester. But I underestimated her. People like Karen don't retreat. They double down, and that's exactly what she did. The morning after the police visit, I stepped outside to head to work. My Jeep was exactly where I left it, but it looked different. At first, I couldn't put my finger on it. Then I realized the windshield was covered in smears of something sticky. Someone had taken what looked like a jar of peanut butter and smeared it across the glass. The handles were sticky, too, and there were smudges on the paint. It wasn't random vandalism. This was personal. This was a message. I stood there gripping my keys, a slow burn rising in my chest. It was one thing to make wild claims, but to come onto my property and put their hands on my Jeep, that crossed a line I wasn't willing to ignore. I took pictures immediately, documenting every smear, every fingerprint. My gut told me exactly who had done it, and I knew this wasn't just a prank. It was a provocation, an attempt to wear me down, to make me give up. On my way to work, I couldn't stop replaying the moment when the officers had left the night before. The smirk on Karen's face told me she thought she had planted a seed of doubt in the neighborhood. To her, it didn't matter that I had shown proof of ownership. What mattered was that now there were whispers, glances, a seed of suspicion she could water. She wanted me to look like the shady new neighbor with something to hide. What she didn't realize was that I had an advantage she couldn't erase, the state attorney. He wasn't just a distant acquaintance either. He was practically family. He'd watched me grow up, celebrated milestones with my family, and treated me like his own. He had always told me that if I ever needed guidance, he was only a call away. That morning, as I scrubbed peanut butter off my Jeep, I decided it was time to make that call. When I explained the situation, he didn't laugh it off. He didn't dismiss it as neighborhood drama. He listened carefully, asked specific questions, and told me to keep a record of everything. Pictures, notes, dates, times. He wanted me to document every single incident, no matter how small. He explained that people like Karen thrive on intimidation and manipulation, but if I stayed calm, collected, and thorough, her behavior would end up being her undoing. That gave me a renewed sense of confidence. For the first time since this nonsense started, I felt like I wasn't alone in the fight. But Karen wasn't slowing down. 2 days later, I came home to find a bright orange sticker slapped on my Jeep's window. At first, I thought it was some sort of prank again, but then I read the words, "Vehicle in violation." My stomach dropped. The sticker claimed my Jeep was improperly parked and threatened towing if not removed. Except my Jeep was parked squarely in my own driveway, well within property lines. It didn't take long to piece it together. Karen had reported my Jeep to the HOA. I hadn't even interacted much with the homeowners association yet. I paid my dues, kept my yard neat, followed the rules. But somehow Karen had convinced them, or at least the board president, that my Jeep was an eyesore. She had spun a story that my vehicle didn't fit the neighborhood aesthetic and violated community standards. It was absurd, but the sticker was proof that she had pull with the HOA, or at least enough persistence to get them involved. That night, as I peeled the sticker off and added it to my growing folder of evidence, I realized Karen's strategy was clear. If she couldn't take my Jeep by force, she would make keeping it such a headache that I'd want to get rid of it myself. What she didn't realize was that every move she made was just digging her deeper. Word began to spread among the neighbors. Some avoided me, clearly influenced by Karen's whispers. Others gave me sympathetic nods, quietly letting me know they saw through her games. One man, while walking his dog, casually mentioned that Karen had been telling people my Jeep was unregistered and possibly stolen out of state. The lie had morphed and grown, reaching ears all across the block. It wasn't just about the Jeep anymore. It was about my reputation. And Karen was determined to tarnish it. But I wasn't about to sit quietly while she smeared my name. I spoke again with the state attorney, who reminded me of something critical. False police reports, harassment, and defamation all had legal consequences. If Karen wanted to play games, I had the law on my side. Meanwhile, Karen grew bolder. One afternoon, I caught her daughter leaning against my Jeep, taking selfies as though it belonged to her. I stepped outside, camera in hand, and the girl quickly moved away. Minutes later, Karen stormed over, accusing me of harassing her daughter. She raised her voice loud enough for the whole street to hear, painting me as the aggressor. I stayed calm, recorded the encounter, and walked away. But inside, I could feel the tension snapping tighter, like a rope stretched to its limit. The turning point came when a second police visit happened. This time, officers arrived after another anonymous call, claiming that my Jeep was blocking the sidewalk and preventing pedestrians from passing. Once again, it was parked squarely in my driveway. Once again, I provided proof. And once again, Karen stood at a distance, watching with folded arms and a satisfied grin. But this time, the officers weren't amused. They pulled me aside privately and admitted they suspected the calls were malicious. They encouraged me to file a report for harassment. That was the moment I knew Karen had overplayed her hand. She thought she was making me look guilty, but in reality, she was making herself look unhinged. I called the state attorney again, and this time his tone was firm. He told me he was ready to step in directly if Karen made one more move. He explained the steps we could take: cease and desist letters, harassment charges, even civil action. He assured me that if Karen wanted to weaponize the system, she was about to learn what it felt like to be on the receiving end. Still, I didn't want to escalate too fast. I wanted to give her enough rope to hang herself. So I waited. I documented. I stayed polite, visible, and calm. And sure enough, Karen delivered. One Saturday afternoon, as I returned from the store, I found a crowd gathered near my driveway. Karen had taken it upon herself to stage a little neighborhood meeting, loudly declaring that my Jeep was unsafe, illegal, and unfit for the community. She spoke with the confidence of someone who thought they held authority, her daughter nodding along beside her. Neighbors shifted uncomfortably, some buying into her theatrics, others clearly embarrassed. I didn't interrupt. I didn't shout. I simply walked up, pulled out my folder, and held up the stack of evidence: photos, notes, police case numbers. I calmly announced that every single accusation she had made was documented and disproven, and that, effective immediately, her harassment was being turned over to the state attorney's office. The look on her face shifted instantly. That smug superiority drained away, replaced by something sharper: fear. She wasn't used to pushback, especially not from someone who had the law standing behind them. The crowd dispersed quickly after that, whispers buzzing in the air. For the first time, Karen looked rattled. But deep down, I knew this wasn't over. People like her don't stop until they're forced to. And if she thought she had seen the worst of me, she was about to get a brutal awakening, because the state attorney was ready to get involved directly, and Karen's little neighborhood power trip was about to collide head-on with the full weight of the law. Karen's neighborhood meeting should have been her moment of triumph. She had gathered her audience, spun her web of lies, and tried to rally the community against me. But instead of cementing her authority, she had exposed herself. The second I mentioned the state attorney's office, I saw something flicker across her face, a crack in the armor. She wasn't invincible anymore, and the neighbors had seen it too. That night, my phone buzzed with messages from a few people in the neighborhood I barely knew. They quietly admitted they had been skeptical of Karen's stories all along, but they hadn't wanted to cross her. Some even apologized for keeping their distance. They told me she had a history of stirring up trouble, everything from filing frivolous HOA complaints to trying to control what flowers people planted in their yards. Suddenly, the picture was much clearer. Karen wasn't just fixated on me. She had a pattern, and I was simply her latest target. The difference this time was that I wasn't playing defense alone. The next morning, I drove to meet with the state attorney in person. His office wasn't far, and when I walked in with my folder of evidence, he gave me a smile that carried more reassurance than I expected. He listened patiently as I laid everything out: the false police reports, the vandalism, the HOA sticker, the staged meeting. He flipped through the photos and notes with a practiced eye, nodding at certain details, frowning at others. By the end, he leaned back in his chair and said something that made my pulse quicken. "She's crossed the line into actionable harassment." He explained that Karen's behavior wasn't just irritating, it was unlawful. The false police calls alone were serious. Add in the defamation, the tampering with my property, and the organized smear campaign, and it became a strong case. He said the first step would be a formal cease and desist letter written on his letterhead, delivered to her directly. It would outline her actions, the laws she had violated, and the consequences if she continued. If she ignored it, the next step would be pressing charges. When I left his office that day, I felt like I had a shield strapped to my back. For weeks, Karen had been the aggressor, always pushing, always testing boundaries. Now, the tables were turning. The letter went out 2 days later. I didn't hand it to her myself. It was delivered formally, the kind of envelope that makes your stomach drop before you even open it. I wasn't there to see her reaction, but I didn't have to be. By evening, the shift in her behavior was obvious. She wasn't strutting past my driveway anymore. She wasn't standing on her porch with her arms crossed, staring me down. Instead, she was quieter, more subdued. For a brief moment, I thought it might be over. But Karen was Karen. And when people like her are cornered, they don't admit defeat, they lash out harder. The first sign came through the HOA. The president knocked on my door one evening, holding a clipboard and looking uncomfortable. He told me there had been several complaints about my Jeep again. Noise, oil leaks, improper parking. All nonsense, of course. He admitted he hadn't seen any of these things himself, but the HOA was obligated to investigate. I could see the hesitation in his eyes. He knew exactly who was behind the complaints, but he wasn't ready to stand up to her. That was when I realized Karen wasn't just fighting me. She was trying to drag the HOA into her personal crusade. She wanted to weaponize them, to use their authority to back up her lies. But what she didn't count on was that the state attorney had already anticipated this move. He drafted a second letter, this time addressed to the HOA itself. It laid out the situation in blunt legal terms. If the association continued to act on false complaints without evidence, they could be complicit in harassment. It was a wake-up call for the board, and suddenly the orange violation stickers stopped appearing. The HOA president, once nervous, now avoided Karen's gaze during community events. For a short while, I thought the tide had fully turned. My Jeep sat untouched in the driveway, the neighbors stopped whispering, and Karen retreated into her house. But peace was never her endgame. One evening, as I was taking out the trash, I noticed something odd. A small group of kids was gathered near my driveway, whispering and pointing at the Jeep. When I got closer, they scattered, but not before I saw what they had been looking at: deep scratches running along the side of the car. Someone had taken a key or a sharp object and dragged it across the paint. My stomach dropped. I knew it wasn't random vandalism. The scratches were deliberate, and the timing too convenient. Karen had been quiet for days, too quiet, and now my Jeep was damaged. I documented it, filed a police report, and added it to my growing stack of evidence. The officers were sympathetic but limited in what they could do without proof. Still, they made a note of my suspicions, and their tone suggested they were tired of seeing my address pop up in their logs. When I told the state attorney, his expression hardened. He said it was time to escalate. The scratches were physical damage to property, not just words or false claims. He began drafting paperwork for a restraining order, one that would legally bar Karen from coming near me, my property, or my Jeep. It was a bold move, one that would mark a point of no return. Meanwhile, Karen seemed to sense the walls closing in. She started playing the victim. I overheard her on the phone in her front yard, her voice carrying loud enough for everyone to hear. She complained about harassment, about being unfairly targeted, about me threatening her family. She was rewriting the narrative, casting herself as the one under attack. A few neighbors bought into it, but most rolled their eyes. Her story was crumbling, and she was grasping at straws. The real breaking point came a week later. Another knock at my door, but this time it wasn't police or the HOA. It was a process server handing me a stack of papers. Karen had filed a civil complaint against me. In it, she claimed I had endangered her family, stolen her peace of mind, and defamed her publicly. It was laughable on the surface, but it was also her most aggressive move yet. She wanted to drag me into court, force me to waste time and money defending myself. What she didn't know was that she had just made the biggest mistake of all. Because by filing that complaint, she opened the door for every shred of evidence I had collected to be presented in a courtroom. Every false report, every smear campaign, every vandalism incident, all of it was now on the table. And standing at my side would be the state attorney, ready to dismantle her case piece by piece. For the first time since this ordeal began, I wasn't anxious. I was eager. Karen thought she could use the system to break me down, but she had underestimated just how prepared I was. The battle was moving out of the neighborhood and into the courtroom, and Karen had no idea how badly she was about to lose. The day I received the civil complaint, I realized Karen had escalated this feud to a level she couldn't easily retreat from. Filing a lawsuit wasn't a casual neighborly spat anymore, it was a declaration of war. She had taken what began as an obsession with my Jeep and turned it into a legal battle she thought she could win. I sat down at my kitchen table, flipping through the thick stack of papers. Most of it was nonsense, exaggerated claims dressed up in legal language. Karen accused me of intimidation, of creating a hostile environment in the neighborhood, and even of interfering with her daughter's personal development by supposedly denying her access to the Jeep. That line nearly made me laugh out loud. It was absurd, but beneath the absurdity was a dangerous strategy. Karen was hoping to bury me in accusations, forcing me to spend time and money defending myself. She thought the sheer weight of the case would make me give in. What she didn't know was that I had a far greater advantage than she could imagine. The state attorney wasn't just a silent supporter anymore. He was stepping into the arena with me. When I showed him the complaint, his reaction was almost amused. He skimmed through the pages, his brow raised, and muttered something about Karen writing checks she couldn't cash. He explained that while anyone can file a civil case, it doesn't mean the case has merit. In fact, false claims could backfire badly on her. If she had lied under oath or presented false evidence, the consequences could extend far beyond a civil dispute. He immediately began drafting my response. For every claim she made, we had documentation to counter it. When she accused me of harassment, we had video proof of her screaming on my lawn. When she alleged that my Jeep was unregistered, we had up-to-date paperwork and DMV records. When she suggested I had intimidated her daughter, we had photographs of her daughter leaning against my Jeep for selfies, unbothered, even smiling. Piece by piece, we were dismantling her case before it even reached a judge. But while the legal wheels were turning, life in the neighborhood grew even more tense. Karen doubled down on her theatrics. She walked her dog past my driveway at odd hours, making sure to sigh loudly or mutter under her breath about unsafe people in the community. She left passive-aggressive notes on other neighbors' doors, warning them to stay vigilant. It was clear she was desperate to paint herself as a victim, to rally sympathy before the court date arrived. Some neighbors bought into her act. I noticed a few people crossing the street to avoid walking directly past my house. Others looked at me with pity, as though I were the troubled newcomer dragging drama into their quiet suburb. But the majority had grown tired of her antics. They had seen the pattern too many times before, and this time, with the involvement of the state attorney, they sensed she might finally be exposed. The weeks leading up to the hearing were filled with preparation. The attorney coached me on what to expect, the questions, the tone, the way Karen would likely present herself. He warned me that she would try to provoke me, to paint me as hot-headed or unreasonable. The key, he said, was to remain calm, factual, and professional. Let her dig her own hole, he told me. She's already holding the shovel. And sure enough, as the hearing date drew closer, Karen's behavior grew more erratic. She began sending emails, not to me, but to the HOA board and even the local neighborhood watch, claiming she was being stalked and harassed. She alleged that I had installed cameras solely to spy on her, ignoring the fact that they were pointed at my own driveway for security. Each email was forwarded to my attorney, and with every word, she was tightening the noose on her own credibility. The morning of the court hearing finally arrived. I dressed neatly, not flashy, and drove downtown with the state attorney by my side. Walking into the courthouse, I felt a mix of nerves and anticipation. Karen was already there, seated with her daughter, flipping through her own stack of papers. She glanced up as we entered, and I'll never forget the expression on her face when she saw who was with me. She hadn't expected the state attorney himself to appear in court on my behalf. That flicker of panic in her eyes told me the outcome was already tilting in my favor. The hearing itself was almost anticlimactic. Karen launched into her accusations, her voice rising as she painted a picture of herself as a harassed, tormented neighbor. She gestured toward her daughter, who sat silently, eyes downcast, playing the role of the traumatized teenager. At first, the judge listened patiently, taking notes, nodding occasionally. But the longer Karen spoke, the more erratic her claims became. She contradicted herself, exaggerated timelines, and at one point insisted that the Jeep had been promised to her family, a statement that drew raised eyebrows even from the courtroom staff. Then it was our turn. The state attorney stood, calm and precise, presenting evidence like a surgeon making careful incisions. He showed the registration and title for the Jeep. He presented photos of the vandalism, reports of false police calls, and copies of the cease and desist letter Karen had ignored. He played video clips of her shouting in the street, undermining her narrative of being quiet and victimized. Every piece of evidence chipped away at her story until it collapsed under its own weight. The judge's demeanor shifted visibly. Where there had once been neutrality, now there was clear skepticism directed at Karen. By the end, the judge dismissed the majority of her claims outright, ruling them unsubstantiated and, in some cases, bordering on frivolous. Not only that, but the judge issued a warning that if Karen continued filing false reports or harassing me, she could face penalties herself. Walking out of that courtroom felt like stepping into sunlight after weeks of storm clouds. I had won. The legal system had seen through her lies, and for the first time, Karen didn't have the upper hand. But the story didn't end there, because Karen wasn't ready to accept defeat. The very next day, she was back outside, ranting to anyone who would listen about how corrupt the judge was, how I had bought off the court, and how she was the victim of a conspiracy. Her daughter trailed behind, looking embarrassed, clearly wishing to be anywhere else. What Karen didn't realize was that her performance had lost its audience. The neighbors who once humored her now avoided her. The HOA board, chastened by the attorney's letter and the court's ruling, distanced themselves entirely. Her empire of intimidation was crumbling. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't done. Karen wasn't the kind of person to let go gracefully. The scratches on my Jeep proved how far she was willing to go, and I knew she had one last card to play. And sure enough, within days, the final act of her campaign began. A desperate move, reckless and poorly planned, that would end up sealing her fate once and for all. The court ruling should have been the end. Karen had embarrassed herself in front of a judge. Her lies had been shredded by hard evidence, and her credibility was at an all-time low. Any reasonable person would have licked their wounds, retreated, and maybe tried to rebuild their reputation quietly. But Karen was not reasonable. In her mind, she hadn't lost. She had been wronged. And when someone like her feels cornered, they don't back down. They go nuclear. It began with little things. One morning, I found a bag of trash dumped on my driveway, its contents scattered like someone had deliberately torn it open. Another time, I woke up to discover eggs splattered across my garage door. Each time, I took pictures, logged the date, and added it to the ever-growing folder of evidence. I knew better than to confront her directly. Confrontation was exactly what she wanted, to bait me into losing my temper so she could twist the narrative again. But these petty stunts were just warm-ups. Her real move came a week later. I was at work when I got a frantic call from a neighbor. Apparently, a tow truck had arrived at my house. The driver claimed he had been authorized to remove a non-compliant vehicle from the property. My heart sank. Karen had tried to have my Jeep towed. I raced home, and sure enough, there was the truck parked in front of my driveway, chains ready. The driver looked confused when I confronted him. He showed me the order, signed by none other than Karen, who had posed as a representative of the HOA. She had forged documents, complete with a fake letterhead, claiming my Jeep was a hazard to the neighborhood. My blood boiled, but I forced myself to stay calm. I pulled out my paperwork, showed the driver proof of ownership, and explained the situation. He wasn't interested in getting caught in the middle of a legal mess, so he unhooked his equipment and left. As he pulled away, I caught sight of Karen peeking through her curtains, her face pale. She had been waiting for the victory lap that never came. That incident changed everything. Petty harassment was one thing, but forging documents and trying to steal my vehicle crossed into serious criminal territory. The state attorney didn't mince words when I told him. He called it attempted fraud and warned that if Karen didn't stop immediately, she could be facing actual charges. The neighborhood, too, had finally had enough. Word of the fake towing order spread quickly. Neighbors who once sat on the fence now openly criticized her. Parents whispered about keeping their kids away from her daughter's influence. Even the HOA board, which had tried so hard to remain neutral, issued a statement distancing themselves from her entirely. Karen's little empire of control was crumbling fast. But Karen wasn't about to surrender quietly. Her next move was bolder and far riskier. One Friday evening, I noticed flashing lights outside my window. Police cars lined the street, their sirens off, but their presence unmistakable. My stomach dropped as officers approached my door. This time, the accusation was far more sinister. Karen had reported that my Jeep was connected to illegal activity. It was a shocking escalation. She claimed she had evidence that I was running some kind of operation out of the vehicle, smuggling or worse. Of course, her evidence was nothing but wild imagination and a handful of photos she had taken of me loading groceries into the trunk. But the seriousness of the accusation meant the police had to investigate. Once again, I produced my paperwork. Once again, I explained the history of false reports. But this time, I had an ace up my sleeve. The state attorney had anticipated she might escalate to something like this, and he had already prepared documentation outlining her pattern of harassment. I handed it over, and the officers, now visibly frustrated, realized they were being dragged into a neighbor's vendetta. The lead officer assured me the report would be noted as unfounded and that Karen herself was quickly becoming the subject of concern. False police reports weren't just annoying, they were crimes, and Karen was stacking them up like dominoes. As the cruisers pulled away, Karen stormed out of her house shouting that I was corrupt, that the system was rigged, and that she would make sure everyone knew the truth. Her daughter tugged at her arm, trying to pull her inside, but Karen wouldn't stop. She ranted and raved in the street, her voice cracking, her face red. The spectacle drew nearly every neighbor to their windows, some even stepping onto their porches to watch, and that's when it hit me. Karen had officially lost the crowd. The same people she had tried to recruit were now shaking their heads, muttering about her losing her grip. Some even recorded the meltdown on their phones, no doubt ready to post it online or hand it over if the authorities needed it. Karen had wanted to be the queen of the neighborhood, the one who controlled the narrative. Instead, she had become its cautionary tale. But still, I knew she wasn't finished. People like Karen don't stop until they're forced to stop. The forged towing order, the false police reports, the street corner meltdowns, they were signs of desperation, yes, but they were also warnings. The state attorney told me we were nearing the end game. He was preparing a full case, one that could result in charges if Karen pulled another stunt. He advised me to stay vigilant, to document everything, and to avoid any confrontation no matter how tempting. Sure enough, the final act was already brewing. Late one night, I heard rustling outside. My cameras caught the movement before I even stepped to the window. There, in the glow of the security lights, was Karen herself, trying to pry open the door of my Jeep. She wasn't hiding behind forged documents or anonymous calls anymore. She was caught, red-handed, attempting to take what she had always believed was hers. The footage captured everything. Her hands on the handle, her muttered curses, her frantic movements when the alarm suddenly blared. She bolted back to her house, but the damage was done. I had undeniable proof of her crossing the ultimate line. By the next morning, the state attorney had the footage in his possession. And this time he didn't talk about letters or warnings. He talked about charges. Serious ones. Karen's obsession had spiraled out of control. She had moved from lies and harassment into attempted theft. And now, finally, she was about to face the consequences she had been running from all along. The morning after the Jeep incident, the neighborhood buzzed with whispers. By now, nearly everyone knew something had happened. Some had heard the alarm blaring in the night. Others had seen the flicker of police lights when they arrived to collect my security footage. And a few had even seen Karen herself, scurrying across my driveway like a thief caught in the act. For months, Karen had thrived on control, spreading lies, twisting rules, and convincing herself she could manipulate the system. But now, she was trapped by the very thing she had mocked so many times. Undeniable evidence. The state attorney wasted no time. He prepared formal charges citing attempted theft, trespassing, and harassment. It was no longer a matter of neighborhood disputes or HOA squabbles. This was criminal. Karen, who had once bragged about knowing the law better than anyone, now found herself on the other side of it. The day officers arrived at her doorstep, the neighborhood froze. Curtains twitched, doors cracked open, and phones discreetly raised to record. Karen, once the self-proclaimed queen of the block, stood on her porch screaming that she was innocent, that she was being framed, that I had set her up. But the officers weren't swayed. They calmly handcuffed her, read her rights, and escorted her to the waiting car. Her daughter stood silently at the doorway, eyes wide and wet with tears. For the first time, I didn't feel anger toward the girl, only pity. She hadn't asked for this. She was collateral damage in her mother's crusade, dragged into chaos she could never have controlled. As Karen was driven away, the neighborhood let out a collective exhale. It was as though a heavy weight had been lifted. For the first time in months, the cul-de-sac felt quiet. But the story didn't end with Karen's arrest. The fallout rippled through every corner of the neighborhood. The HOA, which had once tried to ignore the conflict, was forced to reckon with how much damage had been allowed to fester. At the next board meeting, residents demanded new policies to prevent abuse of authority, forged documents, and false reports. Security cameras went up on more homes, and neighbors who had barely spoken before began swapping phone numbers, promising to look out for each other. Ironically, Karen's reign of terror had brought the community closer together. As for the case itself, it didn't take long. With the evidence stacked against her, the video of the Jeep incident, the fake towing order, the police reports, Karen had little room to maneuver. Her lawyer attempted to argue stress, even desperation, but the court wasn't moved. She was found guilty on multiple counts. While the sentence wasn't long-term prison, it was enough to leave a permanent mark: probation, community service, heavy fines, and, perhaps most damaging to her pride, a restraining order preventing her from coming near me or my property again. For someone like Karen, whose entire identity had revolved around dominance and intimidation, the legal restrictions were a crushing defeat. She could no longer spin the story, no longer demand her way, no longer bully the neighborhood into silence. Her voice, once so loud and constant, had been silenced by the very system she thought she could manipulate. After her sentencing, Karen's house quickly went up for sale. Rumors swirled that she wanted to start fresh somewhere else, far from the humiliation she now carried like a shadow. But no matter where she went, her record would follow her. The neighborhood she tried to control had finally rejected her, and the stain of her actions would be impossible to erase. The Jeep, the symbol of her obsession, remained parked proudly in my driveway. Every time I saw it, I felt a small surge of victory, not because I had won against her, but because it represented something deeper, the reminder that bullies, no matter how persistent, cannot override truth and accountability forever. The strangest part was how quickly normal life returned. The children once again rode bikes in the cul-de-sac without parents hovering nervously nearby. Neighbors who had hidden indoors began hosting barbecues, waving at each other from driveways, even joking about the ordeal. It was as if the dark cloud Karen had cast over us had finally passed, leaving behind clear skies and a stronger sense of community. From time to time, I would catch myself reflecting on everything that had happened. The trash on the driveway, the eggs on the garage, the forged papers, the police visits, it all felt surreal now, like a bad dream. And yet it was also a sharp reminder: some people will stop at nothing when they believe the world owes them something. They will lie, cheat, and even risk criminal charges rather than admit they were wrong. But there's always a limit. There's always a point where the lies collapse under the weight of the truth. In Karen's case, that moment came when she reached for my Jeep, believing she could still take what she thought belonged to her. Instead, she lost everything. The neighborhood moved on, stronger for having endured her chaos. And as for me, I learned a valuable lesson. No matter how loud or aggressive someone becomes, patience, persistence, and the truth are the most powerful weapons you can have. Karen had tried to take my Jeep. She had called the police. She had lied, forged, harassed, and schemed. But in the end, none of it mattered. Because when all was said and done, she wasn't up against just me. She was up against the law itself. And the law had the final word.